welcome everybody to a new installment of The Hot Dish. Today my special guests are Dr. Glenda Humiston, Vice President of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the entire University of California. She has a very big job. And Rob Larew, President of the National Farmers Union. This program is What is Rural? And we're today going to talk about defining what rural is and how important it is when we're looking at public policy. So a couple weeks ago, I was able to participate in a hearing and the Senate House Committee, Ag Committee. And in that hearing, Glenda, one of my guests, raised a really important issue, which is how do you define rural? And obviously, being from California, there is always a concern that people don't appreciate, number one, how agricultural dependent and important California is, but how their unique kind of urban rural locations create real complexities for rural communities in California. And being from a state like North Dakota, which grows completely different crops, which does completely different things than California, I thought this is something I think we need to explore. If we're going to be that One Country project, an entity that looks at national rural issues, we really need to understand this issue better. And who better than the head of the not North Dakota, we always think they're North Dakotans, but who better than the head of the National Farmers Union to engage with this conversation? And so if we can start out, Glenda, by having you kind of talk a little bit about the challenges of public policy application in California, given the definition of rural. And then we'll turn to Rob and ask him if he has a response to that or what he thinks can accommodate a lot of your, I think, very legitimate concerns.
Well, thank you, Senator. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this issue. It's not just California that has this issue. In many ways, it's a Western states issue. And it has to do with a couple factors. One is just how extremely large our counties are. You know, for example, in California, San Bernardino County is larger than 9 U.S. states. We have over 30 counties larger than a U.S. state. And other Western states have similar size issues around counties. So when you have that kind of situation and a definition of rural that says if one community inside that county is over 50,000 population, the entire county is labeled metropolitan, you've just got a ridiculous situation as far as definitions go. And what really exacerbates it in California is actually some good policy we've pursued for the last 30 years. Early in the 1990s, I have to give former governor, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name.
That's okay.
Anyway, the Pete Wilson, Governor Pete Wilson at the time in the early 90s took upon himself to really push a growth management issue, an issue of preserving farmlands and wildlands and trying to create city-centered growth, more efficient use of urban infrastructure. And California has really adopted that, with some fits and starts, certainly over the years. But that has really made our situation worse because we now have larger communities that we've actually protected our farmland around. And so when you try to access programs such as rural development, where you've got a population limit of 10,000 for water systems, we've got huge rural communities that are just over that, 12,000, 15,000, whatever, that can't access these programs that they really should be able to. In fact, it's if you're a community between 10 and 20,000 in size, up to say 100,000 in size, you're really in a political no man's land as far as accessing federal programs.
So I think that lot of people don't think about this. I think in Arizona, there's only 9 counties in Arizona, and so when the kinds of federal policies really adopt county definitions to determine what's rural, we end up with these anomalies, and we end up not serving really significant and important, and in many ways, maybe uh, counties that are maybe economically more distressed than what we think. Rob, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, this is a question of resources. So I'm from a state like North Dakota, and I listen to this about California, and I say, well, does this now mean that I will have a smaller pot of rural development dollars or rural water dollars that I can access if I'm sympathetic from a voting standpoint to the California/Arizona Western concern that Glenda just outlined? And how involved has the National Farmers Union been in kind of exploring and analyzing this issue?
Well, I appreciate the question here because it's an enormous challenge because as has just been kind of talked about, the diversity of the kind of rural urban nexus in a state like California being very different from that of North Dakota, but then several other, whether we're talking about the deep South where you also have high entrenched poverty, Appalachia and so forth. The diversity across the entire kind of rural spectrum is creates enormous challenges for getting those resources out. But I think part of certainly the work that we're trying to do is make sure that some of the fundamental systems that we have that communities can access programs regardless of size for some of those basics like water and sewer and so forth. That's a program, right? Those are incredibly popular. They are way oversubscribed, and traditionally, we don't get enough help out there, regardless of whether or not we're talking about California communities, North Dakota, or West Virginia, for example. And so it's pushing policymakers to make sure that the resources are there for some of these fundamental. We can get into, different definitions and access to programs for economic development, but I think it starts with making sure that the resources there are there for some of those fundamental utilities. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to also talk about broadband and so forth, because when we look at the disparities in rural healthcare and access to economic opportunities, some of these key utility pieces, water, the sewage, and broadband are essential elements to kind of lifting up these communities.
Well, I think when you think about this and you think about the very legitimate issues that Glenda has just raised, and you think about this issue of overprescribed, and just for people who don't work in this policy area, it just means that there's more need than there are dollars available. And when you have a situation like that in public policy, and you don't think you can expand the pot of money that's available, the first thing you think about when you represent a state like North Dakota is, how can I make sure my communities get it and they get themselves in the best position? And I think honestly, that's one of the drivers of this challenge, which is defining what in fact makes a community rural. And so, Glenda, I just give us an idea of what you would change in definitions that would address some of the concerns that you have, or priorities in programs like Rob just talked about. We can talk about access to kind of the bright new shiny object, but that should not be a dependency on accessing healthcare or accessing good quality water or sewer or broadband.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably a lot of small tweaks that could happen, but I would say in the bigger picture, what we really need to do is start breaking down this wall of something's urban, something's rural. Because really, if you think about it, we're all in this together. Our agriculture grows food that goes to cities. Our cities are our markets. And for food processing, as just one example, we don't want big, large food processing, warehousing, cold storage, distribution facilities on our farmland. They need to be in communities, in cities, with wastewater treatment and infrastructure, because they're manufacturing basically once that crop leaves a farm. And we're losing out on so many potential opportunities. A real obvious one here in the West, we're suffering from drought again. And drought is a national issue. It just is in different parts of the nation in different years. But one of the real opportunities is to be able to take this extremely highly treated wastewater that our cities produce and actually get that piped out into rural areas for irrigation. And yet a lot of the rules right now just don't allow that. So I think a short answer to your question is that we really need to start looking at this perhaps on more of a regional basis and how we're really serving the entire system. If you look at the rural business programs, they actually did that in a previous farm bill because they recognized that a lot of the business, the agricultural support businesses were better serving agriculture if they were in communities. So they took that population limit off any agricultural business that was serving farmers. They can be located in a city that's larger. Same thing with farm workers. You really don't want farm workers living on the farm too much. It'd be better for them to be in apartments in a community where their kids can go to school and they've got services. So that's just a couple examples where we've recognized that these artificial population limits don't necessarily serve the agricultural community well.
Well, there's always that issue of, kind of, I don't want things to change. We need repopulation of rural communities. And if I were a cynic and a skeptic about all of this, I would say, that will lead to further depopulation of rural counties in my state. If in fact Fargo can access the same level of services that Grafton can. Now, Grafton's a small community. I'm assuming all our listeners know where Fargo is. It's our largest community. But they understand this. I mean, we labeled our effort One Country Project because I think way too often we try and draw these distinctions between rural and urban instead of what's good public policy for the economy and for the people of our country. And so I think when we look at rural, we know that there's constantly demographic analysis that is done, urban, rural, what's the rural poverty rate, what's the access to education, what's the access to broadband. And we're afraid, quite honestly, Doctor, I'm afraid that if we lose those distinctions too broadly, that we will continue to see rural America, what I would consider rural America, the communities that you support and the communities that I know exist in North Dakota left behind. And
well, I have to push back a little bit because
Okay.
I know what we're doing here in California. And we really are taking a regional approach and a regional triple bottom line approach. We're taking into account the people, the planet, and prosperity. And as we look at things like regional food systems, or yesterday I was in a meeting all day about bio-based products and trying to create a regional strategy around that. We're looking to create jobs and economic development in our small communities. And if that's a key part of the strategy, then you're not going to be depopulating, but you're going to be seeing where the industry clusters and the economic development strategies can appropriately get those jobs and growth in those rural communities.
Well, Rob, I want to bring you into this conversation because the National Farmers Union, yes, worries about what's happening with American agriculture, but I don't think there's any national group on the horizon that really focuses on rural communities, really focuses on the work that needs to be done to improve the quality of life for everyone who lives in rural America. So when you listen to this discussion, what do you take from it as that national advocacy group that, yep, we need to make that change, or nope, this is going to be a problem for the communities that I know exist out there?
Well, I think it's really curious to look at this question of kind of regional kind of development, whether it's regional food systems and so forth, because at least in some respects, that begins to get at one of the heart of the matter that Farmers Union's been focused on for a long time, and that is the fact that in so many of these rural communities, whether farm communities and others, it's their manufacturing jobs and their food processing jobs, et cetera, have all been basically transported out. And so we very much are focused on creating an environment, and that means making sure that we have public policy that is creating incentives and driving development in more kind of regional focus. If you just look at a couple of the headlines these days about the fact that four companies, two multinational companies, control over 85% of the beef industry. What that means for all of these rural communities is that this is an extraction economy. These rural communities are trying to hang on, but don't have any of the processing because it's been moved out and is concentrated in just a few places around the country. So the more that we can drive through our public policy, this not only infrastructure in rural development, but creating incentives for more regional and sustainable kind of food systems and manufacturing systems. I think that that helps everyone in our community, not just the farmers. It helps our schools. It helps everyone along the way.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I want to turn to a couple additional issues like climate and broadband. But before I do that, Glenda, I will tell you, that there is an attitude among a lot of the country that nothing good comes from California. That we can't learn anything from the great work that you do there, even though you're a state that's heavily dependent on agriculture. You're doing some amazing work on climate. I just have been so impressed with the diversity of your economy. How do I overcome that when I say, look, I think that the state of California that's really talking about regional diversity and regional kind of applications has a great model or a great program. I can just see a lot of my colleagues roll their eyes because there just is such a kind of heavy knee jerk against anything that's Californian.
Yeah, and I think that's so sad because I think one of the reasons we are successful here, we're willing to learn from anybody. We look all over the nation and learn. I mean, I have to admit, I've been jealous for decades of your Bank of North Dakota. I want a Bank of California similar to that. And we've actually been working on that a little bit too. But, I'm very active in our Western states regional efforts because a lot of our issues here are a little different than, say, the North Central or the Southern states. And if you look at all the various associations, be it rural development or conservation or, your land grant universities, we do have these large regional associations where we do try to share best practices. So I think there's actually more of that going on than you realize at the program delivery level. I think it's just when you get into politics that everybody loves to find a good reason to bash somebody else.
Well, I want to turn to a couple issues, and as I said, I think that there's opportunity, but we also need infrastructure and we need certainty in policy. I want to talk a little bit about where we see kind of the climate environment. Number one, we just finished at the Bipartisan Policy Center our work on and issued a report on natural climate solutions, be it in forestry or in soils. And we also have, I think there's a growing interest in carbon markets as it relates to agriculture. But I think the work that you're doing in California on biomass is so fascinating. And so, Glenda, if you could just kind of talk a little bit about California's agricultural involvement in climate and what you see working and what you see could be transported out of California to other locations.
Well, we've got a lot of different things going on here. We've had 20 plus years of say examples like our Marin Carbon Project, where we've been looking to see how we can pursue healthier soil that sequesters carbon while producing more grazing for our livestock. That's just one example. Digesters for the dairies, better ways to do no-till that actually keep soil health and less carbon into the atmosphere. And we're also not just looking at the on the farm production either. We're looking at pre-planting and post-harvest activities throughout agriculture to see how we can get the entire supply chain to be more conscious of plant or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And what we find is often when we are implementing something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, once we get the technology mature, it often is saving money for the farmers. Or in some cases, like the work we're doing currently with biomass, my hope is that it's going to become a profit center rather than a cost center. But, we're still, a lot of what holds us back there is infrastructure and supply chains, quite frankly.
Yeah, Rob, I think when you look at this issue, and those of us who grew up in rural communities know that farmers can adapt if they see there's something in it for them. And I know a lot of farmers who have adapted new practices to lower input costs, as the doctor just talked about. But also, the average farmer is in their late 50s, early 60s. They've been doing this a lot of years. They have a lot of I think, resistance to doing something different because they only have a few harvests left, and they're worried that to be early adapters or to change what they're doing may in fact affect their profit center. What do you think is the attitude of farmers that are your membership in terms of adapting new practices, and what would it take to encourage more no-till in states like North Dakota, to encourage more conservation practices that can be good, not only make their businesses more drought resistant, more water conscious, but also maybe provide a stream of income in terms of capturing carbon?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, right, as farmers, we like to think of ourselves as some of the original conservationists, right? We care deeply about the land and making sure that it's going to be not only productive but sustainable over generations, because these family farms want to be able to keep that going well into the future. And so we've had an early kind of appreciation of that, and as you just pointed out, also quick to innovate and try new things. I would just note, I mean, North Dakota Farmers Union was a leader in carbon markets for farmers, back in 2005, 2006. But the infrastructure wasn't there for that to kind of take off. But what it did tell us is very early, farmers appreciated, an opportunity where by adopting different practices, they could be incentivized to participate in this carbon exchange. I think the trick now is much like Glenda has talked about, is getting enough data and information and knowledge and technology to get us beyond kind of this newness, if you will, and to be able to find out what the real kind of monetary opportunities are going to be. A lot of what USDA is focused on right now with their incentivizing pilot programs across the country is looking at ways that farmers can adapt in different ways, working with universities, extension, et cetera. I think that will help us kind of accelerate this period that we're in right now, where a lot of farmers are looking at the potential for carbon markets. They see a lot of potential regulations. They're worried, but they are always going to be looking for that opportunity. That, coupled with their desire to make sure that they ultimately have sustainable operations, both profitable and sustainable into the future, is I think encouraging.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation a couple years back with a large soybean farmer, very engaged in international marketing. And when we talked about this, he said, even if you don't believe it, we're going to have to grow in a more sustainable way, in a more climate friendly way, in order to sustain our international markets. They look at competition coming from South America or competition growing in other parts of the world and say, how can we adapt? The challenge that you have in all of this is the large purchasers that potentially could come into the carbon market are not going to buy carbon credits in a way, or buy carbon credits that present real, in my opinion, real reputational risk. The great example is they buy carbon credits from Indonesia, and they're not going to deforest something. They just move on to the next forest and deforest in another place. And so I think everybody is a little leery of how this is going to work and how we do the certification. I think that Secretary Vilsack has done a terrific job in kind of, expressing, that the ability that we would have to organically grow these programs, no pun intended, but organically grow our climate programming in ways that, number one, provide legitimacy to any kind of carbon market, but also achieve, you know, basically get adapters to adapt the practices. And in that context, it will be a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, if I might just add, on this, as we look at whether it's carbon markets or different technologies, there was a reference to digesters that dairies can take advantage of. We also have to make sure that any kind of public policy that is behind this is careful not to incentivize efficiencies over quality kind of sustainable growth. One concern that we're certainly looking on is if the market opportunities and technology is only accessible by a small few and some of the absolute largest farmers out there, then we have a huge missed opportunity in terms of climate mitigation, but also a missed opportunity for, as we are talking about here, these rural communities. And so I think all of this eye on technology, eye on markets, also has to keep in mind what those incentives are and what the participation across the country of farms of lots of different sizes is going to look like.
Yeah, I want to add to that too, that if we're really truly going to help agriculture pursue climate smart agricultural practices, we've got to really view this as a need for a toolbox with many tools. Carbon markets are potentially a very valuable tool in certain situations and with the kind of guardrails that Rob just pointed out the need for. We're really looking at a much broader umbrella of ecosystem services. How do we start valuing and quantifying and compensating landowners to produce the kind of ecosystem services we all need that deal with drought as well as climate change and risk management? Things like groundwater recharge and wetlands mitigation. And we've got examples out there, but we've got to really start making those more available, and we have to better understand them.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. And the challenge that you have, again, and both of you had like your response, the American farmer is an older person. I mean, whether it's male or female, the people who are doing a lot of this work, as we know, are older. They look into the future. They have 5 to 10 more harvests before they kind of move on. And so this is, as you all know, in your life, you're going to get more conservative. You're going to say, look, I'm not going to be the innovator necessarily that I should be at this point in time. And the question that I have, and then on the other side, as you saw, Glenda, during the hearing in the House, that there was one side of the political aisle that didn't want to talk about this, that did not want to talk about, what could work on climate. But the longer we delay that conversation, the longer we're going to delay policy. But it really shows you the potential for, I think, political resistance to that kind of incentivized system, Glenda, that you're talking about.
But Senator, you yourself just fed that very dichotomy. You're talking about our farmers being older, therefore they're conservative. And I push back every time somebody says that because I don't believe it's true. American farmers for decades have proven they're some of the most innovative and sometimes almost crazy risk takers out there. That isn't the problem. The problem is when you are a farmer and you are well established, You've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars tied up in your own personal infrastructure, your buildings, your equipment, your whatever you need to do for farming the crop you farm the way you do. It's not easy to shift that. It's expensive. That is what makes it hard for farmers to do quick, rapid shifting of their farming practices. It's not their lack of interest most of the time. It's just that when you've got all that money sunk into hardware and facilities, you can't shift quickly.
Yeah.
And that's, we have to understand that if we're going to create the policy and programs to help them.
Yeah, I think I understand that, but I also live in a place that, if you look at no-till, we've been doing no-till in Western North Dakota for a lot of years, born out of necessity, not out of an interest in innovation. But I can take you to the Red River Valley in the winter, and you're going to see ditches full of topsoil. And so it's not like it's not like there isn't a resistance, I think, to early adaption or even adaption of longstanding practices. And that the first thing you'll get when you talk about this is don't take away what I already have. I want the certainty of being able to continue to use the practices that I'm using right now without any kind of change. And then if I'm profitable in using those practices, how interested am I in something different that would add, number one, I agree with you, add maybe additional infrastructure costs in terms of equipment or different seed varieties or whatever it might be. How innovative am I going to be if I'm profitable the way I do it right now and there isn't any kind of regulation or mandate on the horizon that encourages, the carrot and the stick. If the carrot is something that's additive, and that's all you have, I think that makes the challenge more difficult.
I think that these are really good points. I think that one of the pieces here is that we have to get still more information out there. We have these examples in parts of the country that have kind of been driven, as you said, out of necessity toward different adaptations and so forth. The fact is that even in areas where that hasn't necessarily taken up, financial margins are growing, ever so narrow. And so we have to find, ways as business owners to increase that margin. And so whether it's through these pilot programs that USDA is looking at different models and different ways to approach this, but being able to capture some of the value, not just in terms of like future sustainability, but being able to affect our bottom line each year, I think that will be one of the keys to greater adoption.
Well, yeah, I think that's why we're so interested in this concept of ecosystem services. I also think that technical assistance you're discussing is critical. That's one reason why I'm currently recruiting over 100 brand new cooperative extension scientists here in California. And some of them are in some fairly new areas. They're not just simply helping our farmers be more productive and grow crops better. We're actually putting cooperative extension specialists out in the field that are looking at how to create those regional food systems and small scale grocery manufacturing and ecosystem services. I'm placing some ag technology specialists that are going to be doing research on what kind of ag technology can be developed specifically for small and medium scale farmers. And I think, basically providing that type of public R&D to our agricultural community is going to be critical in helping them meet these challenges.
Well, we have to be mindful of time here. I just want to ask both Glenda and Rob. I mean, we've had such a great conversation, and I think an important conversation with a lot of perspective. I'd love to get back together with both of you and schedule an ongoing conversation as we see these concepts move forward in public policy. And so from my standpoint is, how do you take a region of the country that is more skeptical of the need for uh, to adapt practices that are, as you talk about, ecosystem practices, or practices that are climate friendly, that are water friendly, that are conservation friendly. um, the political dynamic of this really challenges, I think, us, as people who believe that the future of agriculture has always been in adaptations. It's always been in new technologies. How do we then kind of advance our interests in ways that aren't punitive, and get adapters to really create a renaissance? I mean, when you think about it, that the I always say the history of American agriculture was built on two fundamental practices. And, a lot of people I'd love to have this debate, but a lot of people would disagree. I would tell you the co op model, which I think was critical in terms of adaptations. And out of that co op model, Glenda grew the Bank of North Dakota. This is a 1920s invention to really push back. And it was a way to co op capital. But the other thing is the land grant colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And I am so fascinated by the work that you're doing at Davis, Glenda. But I'm telling you, if you're hiring 100, we're going to have a heck of a time hiring that same workforce in North Dakota. And as you know from my testimony, I continually brought all this back to workforce and training the trainers, if we want adaptations and to advance new techniques that can be both climate smart and create a better economic opportunity on the farm.
Well, don't feel too jealous, because we have a real challenge with recruitment here because of the high cost of living in California.
Yeah, but you want to compete with 40 below, Glenda?
Yeah, no. Hey, I choose. I grew up in Colorado in the mountains. I choose not to live in 40 below anymore.
But I think this workforce issue, I will tell you, Rob and Glenda, I think getting young people, young scientists excited about participating and start talking. In North Dakota, 90% of our land mass, think about this, is engaged in production agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to be part of the climate discussion in North Dakota beyond what we do in energy, we need to be engaging and kind of on the cutting edge. Everybody wants to be part of that new, I wouldn't say bright shiny object, but they want to be part of something that is innovative and new and isn't the same old. And I think there's a real opportunity to get young scientists and young professionals excited about this area of practice. But we have to tell them that there's real opportunity here.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I especially agree with you about the value of cooperatives and the land grant institutions. That was actually a big part of our discussion yesterday. I was up at the far north end of California. We're talking about use of cooperatives for all kinds of things. And we have used it for broadband in really major projects here in California. And we didn't even get to broadband today.
Well, and honestly, Rob, I think North Dakota has some of the best rural broadband in the country.
Oh, yes.
That only came about because we have the best co-op system.
Absolutely. It is a model that I wish could be replicated in other areas here. But I tell you, some of these basic, as we look at the opportunity and even the workforce challenges and so forth, I mean, it comes back to some of those fundamentals still that, if we don't have in these rural spaces really fundamental utilities, that's healthcare, that's broadband, that's water and sewer. I mean, we have to get that right in order to create the opportunities for everything else.
Well, can I get you guys to come back? I think this has been such a great conversation. I think it's also, Glenda, for a lot of our listeners who listen in the rural South, a real opportunity to spread the good word of what you're doing in California, what you're doing with like-minded people within your consortiums and within your groups. And Rob, obviously, the National Farmers Union is such a critical part of spreading the message to the policymakers, talking about kind of this broad array of opportunity, not just, I think the immediate reaction among farmers in my part of the country is, here it comes again. It's another regulation that I'm not going to get compensated for. It's another burden on my land. And when we can get beyond that and say, this is part of a really innovative kind of new way of thinking about agriculture that adapts a lot of the old way, which is the stewardship, which is the conservation programs that were born out of the 30s, which is the land grant colleges, the co-op models, the things that really came out of American agriculture that have been the reason why American agriculture is the most innovative, successful economic story, I think, in the history of our country.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. It was a great conversation, and I think you're absolutely correct that those various components you just named off from agriculture offer so much opportunity, and they're going to produce far more than a regulatory regime.
Yeah, I agree. So, Rob, I hope we can get all back together again.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you. What a great conversation, and it's so wonderful to think about policy. I think the other challenge that we have is when people think about politics, they hate politics. We can't even get people to run in rural America. But if they think that this is why we do politics, so we can do the right policy for the future and for the United States of America and for the future of the world, that is a different and broader kind of calling, and it's broader than just a political calling.
Absolutely. Like most farmers, I'm ever the optimist, and future looks bright.
Thanks to both of you. Really appreciate the conversation, and let's get together again.
Great. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you.